When discussing the Meng Wanzhou incident, one must first address why the United States sought to arrest Meng Wanzhou. In 1980, an armed conflict broke out between Iraq and Iran. The war began with Iraq's invasion of Iran. Iraq's primary rationale for the attack was to prevent the spread of Iran's new ideology into Iraq. Moreover, Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, was concerned that Iran could exploit Iraq's sectarian tensions to mobilize Iraq's Shia majority against the government. The ongoing conflict between these two nations was, in essence, a struggle for dominance in the Middle East. And to be the top power in the Middle East, possession of nuclear weapons was deemed essential. Hence, Iran was persistently striving to develop its nuclear capabilities, a fact that came to the attention of the United States. To prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons and from supporting terrorist activities, the United States started imposing sanctions on Iran. Initially, it was actually the United Nations that began imposing sanctions on Iran, followed by comprehensive sanctions from the United States. In addition to aggressively targeting Iran's financial and energy sectors and restricting exports, there were also sanctions implemented against individuals in Iran and Syria, including asset freezes. It can be said that the sanctions were thorough and all-encompassing. Iran suffered significant impacts, with its currency devaluing and foreign exchange reserves declining. At the societal level, the sanctions led to price increases and a higher cost of living, which caused immense hardship for both the Iranian citizens and government. The Iranian government continuously attempted to circumvent the sanctions using various methods. Meng Wanzhou and Huawei Group played a significant role in aiding Iran to evade these sanctions. A company named Skycom, which was originally a subsidiary of Huawei's subsidiary, Huawei Marine Networks, had all its key decisions derived from Huawei. The regional director of Skycom in Iran was also a Huawei employee. Later on, Huawei transferred the ownership of Skycom shares to a holding company owned by Huawei, called Canicula. To summarize, when Huawei transferred the shares of Skycom from one of its subsidiaries to another Huawei subsidiary, Canicula, it essentially went in a circle, with Skycom's shares still being sold to an entity controlled by Huawei. Meng Wanzhou, as Huawei's chief financial officer, did not fully disclose these details to HSBC Bank. HSBC Bank was aware that the company dealing with Iran, Skycom, was a subsidiary of Huawei Marine Networks and that it had supposedly sold its shares in Skycom. HSBC also knew that Canicula was another subsidiary of Huawei. However, what HSBC did not know was who the shares of Skycom had been sold to. Huawei and Meng Wanzhou, of course, would not inform them that they sold to themselves. As a result, HSBC Bank made the assessment that Skycom was no longer a subsidiary of Huawei. Consequently, HSBC decided to extend a loan of several $100 million to Huawei. With this money, Huawei conducted business with Iran through the company Skycom. Unbeknownst to HSBC, they were providing financial services for the trade between Huawei and Iran, which ostensibly appeared as transactions between Skycom and Iran. Since these transactions were settled in US dollars, it was only a matter of time before they were uncovered by the US clearing system. Huawei was found to have violated US laws regarding export controls on Iran. As for Meng Wanzhou, being the chief financial officer, she provided incomplete information which misled HSBC into providing the loan to Huawei. So if you ask whether Meng Wanzhou committed fraud, it could be said that there was and there wasn't. It wasn't because Meng Wanzhou did indeed accurately report her statement as true, it was HSBC's own misjudgment. HSBC should not have granted the loan to Huawei. The argument that there was indeed fraud lies in the fact that Meng Wanzhou did not proactively inform HSBC Bank that the shares of Skycom had been sold to a holding company controlled by Huawei. Meng simply stated that the shares had been sold, leading HSBC to believe that Skycom was no longer under Huawei's subsidiary. Although HSBC was aware that Skycom was previously a subsidiary of Huawei Marine Networks, a subsidiary of Huawei, they thought that after the sale of shares, Skycom was no longer controlled by Huawei. The critical point here is that HSBC was unaware of who Skycom's shares had been sold to, which is a detail that needs to be emphasized repeatedly. It is also the key point of contention in Meng Wanzhou's and Huawei's legal team's defense strategies. Personally, I believe that Meng Wanzhou committed bank fraud because her ultimate goal was to complete a transaction with Iran. She obtained a loan by not providing HSBC with complete information, which constitutes fraud. One cannot expect a bank to investigate as thoroughly as a private detective agency. If a bank makes a wrong lending decision because it was not provided with all the pertinent information, it's not fair to place the blame solely on the bank. The primary issue should lie with Huawei and Meng Wanzhou. It is clear that this involves bank fraud and conspiracy to launder money. It's not a case where Meng Wanzhou can simply say she doesn't admit guilt and the FBI will declare her innocent. This is analogous to a murderer being caught, claiming innocence, while the police have clear evidence of the murder. Can you say that the murderer's defense of innocence is correct? This logical train of thought should be as follows. Huawei must be aware of this, but Huawei cannot admit to any wrongdoing publicly. After all, this is a company that carries the hopes and future of the nation. Ren Zhengfei had no choice but to quickly figure out how to get Meng Wanzhou out. On December 1st, Meng was arrested in Vancouver. The Canadian police informed Meng Wanzhou that she had broken the law and that the United States had initiated charges against her. She was told she had the right to remain silent, but anything she said could be used as evidence in court. Subsequently, Meng Wanzhou was taken to a nearby women's prison. How could Ren Zhengfei, worth billions of dollars, accept such humiliation? The Chinese greatly value face, so Ren Zhengfei immediately hired a high-priced lawyer from Vancouver who immediately applied for bail, citing the poor conditions of the prison where Meng was held. They claimed Meng's health was very poor, she suffered from hypertension, and was a thyroid cancer survivor, meaning she had undergone surgery and required medication at regular intervals, suggesting that she was portrayed as quite pitiable, as though she couldn't take her medication on time while in prison. In addition, it was mentioned that Meng Wanzhou suffered from sleep apnea, which I looked up and found refers to when the body awakens naturally in response to decreased blood oxygen levels to restore normal breathing. This mainly affects sleep, so you could question whether this condition is serious enough to not be able to stay in prison. However, since Meng Wanzhou is Ren Zhengfei's daughter and the CFO of Huawei, it is natural that she would not be suitable for prison regardless of whether she had committed a crime or not. Some media claim that the United States is using this incident to make things difficult for Ren Zhengfei and Huawei, which doesn't make sense. Huawei is not so powerful that it would cause the United States to lose credibility and target such a small enterprise. There are many technological giants within the United States that China cannot even hope to match. Friends in China should not be brainwashed by advertisements that claim Huawei is far ahead. To believe that Huawei is invincible can seem rather, well, overconfident, or in modern parlance, delusionally confident, which is a kind of folly. In fact, even Meng Wanzhou herself was a bit puzzled at her arrest, thinking, I haven't even been to the United States. How can Canada arrest me and extradite me to the United States? So, the key to rescuing Meng Wanzhou lies in preventing the United States from successfully extraditing her from Canada. In the days that followed, the situation became very interesting. On December 7, 2018, the bail hearing for Meng Wanzhou was held at the BC Supreme Court in Vancouver. The prosecution charged Meng Wanzhou with fraud and violating U.S. sanctions measures. The prosecution argued that Huawei used a Hong Kong-registered company, Skycom TechCo, to resell American high-tech products to Iranian enterprises, thereby violating U.S. sanctions against Iran. Meng Wanzhou herself was directly involved in misrepresentations to American banks. Her statements to financial institutions constituted fraud, exposing the institution to the risk of having its license revoked. The prosecution also requested that the court deny bail. The reasons for bail presented by Meng Wanzhou at the Canadian bail hearing included: first, she was willing to accept electronic monitoring and proposed a detailed electronic surveillance plan to the judge, which would be overseen by a private security company, Lionsgate Risk Management. This company would have the authority to arrest her if she violated bail conditions. Second, her properties and family ties were reasons she would not flee. The defense argued that Meng Wanzhou owned 2 properties in Vancouver and would not bring disgrace upon her family, Huawei, and China by fleeing. Third, if granted bail, she would only be allowed to move within a specific monitored area, accompanied by a designated driver and a security team monitoring her 24 hours a day. Fourth, Meng Wanzhou agreed to wear an ankle monitor, with technical support provided by Recovery Science Corporation, a company experienced in tracking individuals on bail. Fifth, she proposed to surrender all her valid passports as one of the conditions for her bail. The United States did not agree to the Canadian court's decision to grant bail to Meng Wanzhou. The U.S. rationale was mainly twofold. First, the criminal charges Meng was involved with were very serious, with a sentence of up to 30 years, indicating severe criminal conduct. Second, Meng Wanzhou possessed 7 passports and, given her personal wealth and power, she was highly likely to flee Canada. Once Meng returned to China, where there is no extradition treaty between China and the U.S., she would never stand trial. The outcome of this hearing was that Canada did not agree to the bail. However, the situation subsequently changed. 3 days after the hearing, on December 10th, the Chinese government, citing national security concerns, ordered the arrest of 2 Canadians within China, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, accusing the 2 Michaels of endangering China's national security. The Canadian government views this as China's retaliation for the Meng Wanzhou incident. According to Canadian media reports, the 2 Canadians were transferred to a detention facility where they underwent up to 8 hours of interrogation each day. The lights in their cells were on 24 hours a day, and both Michaels were denied visits from embassy consular officials and their lawyers. In response, the Chinese government claimed that Western media was spreading false information to smear and slander China, and declared that the criminal facts regarding the 2 Michaels were clear, that they had admitted to their crimes and had already signed related confession documents. Many people might speak favorably for China, believing that the 2 Canadian citizens were indeed arrested for violating Chinese laws. There are those who are naive enough to think this way. First, China does not have a political and legal system where powers are independent of each other. Second, the timing of China's arrest of the 2 Canadian citizens is very delicate, occurring precisely after Meng Wanzhou's bail was denied. Moreover, the day after the 2 were detained, the Canadian court approved Meng Wanzhou's bail application, a move that cannot help but be seen as filled with the smoke of political struggle. The following day, on December 11th, Meng Wanzhou was granted bail by the Supreme Court of British Columbia, with the case adjourned until February 2019 for a further hearing. The Chinese government has shown the world China's methods of hostage diplomacy, which are extremely deplorable. On January 28, 2019, the Acting Attorney General of the United States formally announced a request for the extradition of Meng Wanzhou on the grounds that she was suspected of defrauding banks about the sanctions against Iran imposed by the United States, and charged Huawei with 23 counts. In response, Huawei stated that it was disappointed with the accusations against the company. The following day, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Geng Shuang took a firm stance during a regular press conference, accusing the U.S. and Canada of abusing the bilateral extradition treaty between the two countries and seriously infringing upon the legitimate rights and interests of a citizen of the People's Republic of China. He urged the United States to withdraw the arrest warrant and stop the formal extradition request. On February 13, 2020, the Eastern District Court of New York announced a new lawsuit brought by the United States Department of Justice against Huawei, which included allegations that Meng Wanzhou committed fraud and violated the United States Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. Act. On November 4, 2020, Huawei filed a lawsuit against the United States government in the Federal District Court of Washington, D.C., accusing 16 U.S. government departments of delaying the disclosure of numerous important documents related to the Meng Wanzhou case, while also demanding that the relevant U.S. departments communicate with the White House regarding the complaint. Interestingly, Meng Wanzhou's legal team actually requested the White House to intervene in the judicial case. On February 13, 2020, the U.S. Department of Justice brought 16 new criminal charges against Huawei, adding an allegation of conspiracy to steal trade secrets. Huawei and its 4 subsidiaries were accused of conspiring to commit extortion and conspiracy to steal trade secrets in violation of the United States Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO. The indictment mentioned that Huawei's subsidiaries in the U.S. and China have, for decades, been engaged in efforts to steal intellectual property from 6 U.S. technology companies. The indictment also accused Huawei and its subsidiaries of engaging in commercial and technology projects in countries restricted or sanctioned by the U.S., the European Union, or the United Nations. In addition, Huawei was accused of assisting the Iranian government in surveillance of the United States. On January 12, 2021, Meng Wanzhou applied for the relaxation of her bail conditions, requesting permission to leave her residence without the presence of security personnel. However, Meng Wanzhou's application was rejected. The concern was that if Meng Wanzhou went out without security personnel, it could potentially be an attempt to flee. It had been previously mentioned that Meng Wanzhou had 7 passports, a fact that is still remembered by many. On August 18, 2021, the final round of hearings in Meng Wanzhou's extradition case concluded. The U.S. prosecutor's representatives failed to offer a defense regarding HSBC's continued financial services to Huawei, despite being aware of its dealings with Iran. The judge decided to postpone the final verdict, while Meng Wanzhou applied for the release of more confidential documents related to her arrest and interrogation. However, this request was denied by a Canadian federal judge on the grounds that it was unrelated to the case. The absence of a defense was actually very unfavorable for the United States. If the U.S. stands for justice, and Meng Wanzhou did indeed make false statements to HSBC about who the shares of Skycom were sold to, it would have been appropriate for the U.S. prosecutors to present their case in court in a timely manner. In early September 2021, U.S. President Joe Biden spoke with Chinese President Xi Jinping, requesting the release of 2 Canadians, while Xi Jinping focused on the case of Meng Wanzhou. Under Xi's firm stance, the United States, in order to protect its Canadian citizens, decided to make concessions. In fact, the U.S. approach was correct. Exchanging 2 Canadians for 1 Chinese citizen does not result in a loss in terms of numbers. If the U.S. did not agree to release Meng Wanzhou in exchange for the 2 Canadians, what would be the direction of Canadian public opinion? It could be argued that the government, in pursuing foreign diplomacy, is putting the lives of Canadian citizens at risk, which would diminish the credibility of the Canadian government. Then, whether the U.S. proceeds with the extradition or not would become meaningless. Attempting to reason with an unreasonable country, in this case China, and involving 2 Canadian citizens is essentially pointless. Subsequently, on September 24, 2021, Meng Wanzhou participated in a U.S. court hearing via video conference from Vancouver, Canada. Although Meng did not plead guilty to the U.S. allegations of bank fraud during the hearing, she did not dispute the facts and statements related to the case, indicating that Meng acknowledged misleading international financial institutions regarding Huawei's business dealings with Iran. Following the hearing, Meng reached a deferred prosecution agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice. The U.S. Department of Justice decided to defer prosecution based on Meng's admission of certain wrongful conduct under the agreement. The deal was set to expire in December 2022. If Meng did not engage in further illegal activity during this period, the fraud charges against her could be dismissed upon the agreement's expiration. Ultimately, the Canadian court lifted all bail conditions on Meng Wanzhou, allowing her to leave Canada freely. Meng then departed Canada on a Chinese government-chartered plane and arrived in Shenzhen on the evening of September 25. On the day of Meng's release, China freed 2 Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, who had been detained in China. Around 5:40 a.m. on September 25, Eastern Time in the U.S., 7:40 a.m., Kovrig and Spavor arrived in Calgary on a Royal Canadian Air Force aircraft, where they were greeted and embraced by Prime Minister Trudeau and the Foreign Minister at the airport. The timing of the releases of Meng, Kovrig, and Spavor clearly indicated a connection between the 2 events. Although China has always denied any link, the timing of their flights has effectively acknowledged this as an act of hostage diplomacy. Following this incident, Canadian public opinion has decisively turned against China, and Sino-Canadian relations seem irreparable. Without Meng's release, there would have been no other way to rescue the 2 Michaels, and the Biden administration's compromise finally put an end to the matter. 6 months prior to their release, Canada's ambassador to China, Dominic Barton, spent weeks in Washington trying to persuade the U.S. Department of Justice, Huawei, and Meng's lawyers to reach an agreement. However, after President Biden took office, determined to rebuild public trust in American institutions, he decided to take a non-interventionist approach to the U.S. judicial administration. Canada had pressured the U.S. to negotiate the case and reach a deferred prosecution agreement. While the U.S. considered Huawei's conduct to be illegal, it also gradually realized that other banks and institutions that violated Iranian sanctions had not been treated in the same way. One might question whether the Biden administration's lenient stance facilitated Meng's escape from judicial trial to some extent. Even during her arrest, Meng Wanzhou was still allowed to reside in a mansion in Vancouver, while the 2 Canadians were detained in much harsher prison conditions. Who will compensate for their trauma? Huawei has not been punished, and does this mean that the Chinese government will occasionally engage in hostage diplomacy? However, China's retaliation against Canada did not stop there. On March 5, 2019, a Canadian grain processor confirmed that the People's Republic of China had banned the import of canola seeds from the company due to harmful organisms repeatedly detected in canola seed imports from Canada. Hence, a decision was made to suspend imports according to laws, regulations, and international practices. Additionally, Chinese citizens began to boycott Canadian products, and the Canadian government advised, unless necessary, try to avoid traveling to mainland China to prevent retaliatory actions by the government of the People's Republic of China, and is considering relocating some conference venues to places outside of China. China, by taking hostages instead of using diplomatic channels, has eroded the goodwill towards China that Western countries have been cultivating slowly over decades. At the same time, China has lost the trust of governments, citizens, and public opinion in Canada and many parts of the world. Yet, China pretends to disdain these attitudes, continuing to tout its economic growth on the global stage, intimidating Taiwan and its neighbors with military might. Apart from Middle Eastern countries, Russia, and some African nations, China has been antagonistic to almost everyone, which is a regrettable way for the country to present itself to the world. Hours after the U.S. Department of Justice reached an agreement with Meng, China released Canadian citizens Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. How can China justify releasing these Canadians now? Shouldn't there also be a legal explanation to the nation's people for their release? An explanation made public to society should not involve state secrets, right? Similarly, China will never admit what Meng Wanzhou and Huawei actually did. When a country behaves like a rogue for its own interests, what more can we say? That concludes the whole affair of Meng Wanzhou. If you liked my explanation, please click subscribe and the bell icon. This channel will provide you with analysis of hot topics. Thank you.